the virtual engagement hub link on the front page of the city website and also linked on the Noise Advisory Board page. For those of you out there with us today, welcome. I will now go through and introduce all of the board members who are participating virtually today. Please make sure to mute your microphones if you are not speaking. When you have a question or would like to speak, please unmute your microphone. Board members, as I call your name, please acknowledge your presence. Rick Freeman.
Present.
Reb Haslib.
Here. Hazlip.
Hazlib. Sorry, Reb.
Rob.
Carmelo Papalonio.
Present.
Jeff Sandiaco. No Jeff? Okay. David Ledger. David Ledger. No David Ledger. Okay. Also joining us today is Councilwoman Antoinette Mosley.
Good afternoon.
Thanks for being here. And Noise Administrator Todd Justice.
Hello.
And staff member Ashley Stanley.
Hi.
Hi. Okay, so first order of business is to see if there's any discussion for the minutes for the November board meeting. Any discussion? Okay, can I get a motion to approve the minutes? Reb? Thank you. Can I get a second?
Second. Rick.
Carmelo, can I get a yay or nay?
Yay.
And I also yay. So motion is approved. Okay, moving on to the next order of business, we have the noise administrator check-in. Todd, we had talked about doing having somebody, staff person, talk to us about looking at that data and if there's any trends from 2021 to 2023 that we should talk about and be aware of. You're muted, Todd. It's not a virtual meeting if somebody doesn't do that, right?
Virtual. I would like to do that next session. We'll get pull that data together and create some spreadsheets and kind of collate the data for you guys to look at, and we will provide a short brief on what we do put together for that. And it will just be basically numbers compared to this year's numbers compared to last year's numbers and that sort of thing. If you need that prior to you briefing the group on the annual report, then we'll get that together before that deadline.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, that would be good, because I think that seeing that data will help us to look at going forward. What are some of the areas that we could potentially focus on as a board to have an impact?
Right.
That might need some additional work with mitigation. So, okay, well, thanks for that. We can get up after and figure out what makes the most sense as when we need that info. All right, moving on to old business. So first thing we have is vehicular noise. And this, there's a lot to talk about here, right? So we know that we've had some public comment with people still complaining about vehicular noise. Reb had done a good amount of work and research as heading up a working group. And then I took the baton and ran with it, with doing some fact finding and talking to residents that live downtown and talking to business owners downtown. So a little bit of an update is this is one of the things that we did go in front of the safety and planning committee. Rick and I did and talked about some proposed ideas on how to address this. We've hit a little bit of a roadblock with some of these things, mainly because the way the ordinance is written, this is one of those interesting things because it does have to be enforced by law enforcement. So that means that the noise administrator's office doesn't really have the capacity to do citations or anything when it comes to the vehicle noise, especially when it comes to modified mufflers and things like that. We also know that the language is pretty old in terms of the noise advisory board, of the noise ordinance, and that it probably needs to have some updating. So these are a couple things that we need to address. And lastly, the last thing that I'm going to say about this before I open it for discussion is, we know, as we said in front of Planning and Safety Committee or Environment and Safety Committee, that we know that there's other issues that are more pressing, obviously, for law enforcement to be dealing with. But as our role as Noise Advisory Board is to help to find points of leverage and to, help to mitigate some of the noise sources that are happening. And this is definitely something that's, it's not going away. And we're hearing that there's challenges for it. We need to figure out a way that we can still make that work. And if we can't make an effort, or if we can't make an impact in this way, then I think part of what we need to do is be honest with the public with that, and just saying our hands are tied with this right now. So I'll open it up for discussion in terms of vehicular noise and anything that people want to add to that.
Well, Jessica, this is Reb. I'll just say that when I concluded my research some months back before you took it over, I had a conversation at the time, I think it was with Captain Lamb at APD, who was amenable to the idea that enforcement could occur simultaneously with what at the time was an increased saturation of police presence downtown, which seems to be largely the center of the problem. And in that research, there were a handful of mechanisms to deal with noise. One, of course, is setting sound level limits, and there's a lot of national precedent for how to do that. And the other way, one of the odd ways that's occurring across the country now is with noise cameras, which is a remote mechanism for assessing the loudness of a vehicle down the street. And there's another one, but my brain is not landing on what the other one is right now. Cruising. If you limit the amount of cruising, that is the number of times that an individual vehicle makes a certain point in a certain area within the CBD, that can be considered something that's a violation. And those are the primary mechanisms. But I do recall that there was some, I wouldn't call it agreement, but a willingness to discuss the possibility of police enforcement with some of those measures.
So thank you, Reb, for that. And it's good to know that you had talked to Captain Lamb. And I think that's what I think needs to happen is if there's a way that we can continue that conversation. I know you and I need to talk about you taking this back over. I'm happy to help with, tag team it with you too. So I'm just wondering if you would be comfortable maybe with the next step is reaching back out and seeing if we can't set a meeting so that we can just go directly to the source and just say, what's the feasibility of like you said, right? Tacking this on to something that's already happening.
Right.
With an initiative that's happening downtown, right? Is there some way that we can have some enforcement that we know the busiest times are Friday and Saturday night? And so is there some sort of initiative that's already happening that you could do 90 minutes of enforcement on this Friday, and this Saturday in a 30-day span that could be, just to see if it has an impact, right? And I think that's part of the issue, right? As we know, things move a little bit slow when it comes to dealing with city politics, and the squeaky wheel gets the grease sort of thing, right? We know there's other things that are important, but I'm wondering if, because that's the thing is keeps trying to get lumped into other initiatives that are happening which I get, but I just feel like if it's as simple as having a conversation and saying, could you put some, we're talking 3 hours, right, of time in a month to this. Is that something you'd be willing to do? And it might get us further down the road,
Well, I'm happy to take that on. The other thing that I would be willing to do, because there is so much precedent, is to look at excerpts from other ordinances that seem to apply to our situation in terms of noise. Whether that's modified mufflers, whether that's street mufflers, whatever it is. But we could begin to put together some language that as a group we could review, possibly approve, move it through the various protocol places in the city.
That's a great idea. Yeah. Anytime we can do the lifting of that and be able to put it in front of city council. And I'm going to get to Rick here, and then we can maybe dive into that with Todd in terms of the challenges with the language and have an idea of what it needs to read, and then maybe find some other cities that have figured that out.
Okay.
Rick, you got your hand up?
Yeah, so I support everything Reb just said. My remembrance was that we didn't want to make the police force commit to doing routine enforcement. We wanted to see if we could create the notion of a deterrence by signage, fines, and public awareness around at least one enforcement event, right? So
Right.
I would put that for Reb to think about, because it's one thing to say, yes, we'll give you an hour on a Saturday and we're going to go in and crack down, and we're going to have all the people there, and we're going to block the street if we have to, or whatever they think is necessary to have effective stuff. And to make sure that we've got WLOS cameras handy and citizen time reporters in the vicinity, so it gets a bunch of press about, hey, they're cracking down on vehicle noise. We might, if we could get an hour of enforcement at a known great time, then we could see what the impact is. And 2 months later, if it dropped off for 3 Saturdays in a row, then nobody got arrested, and then it started to creep back up again, we'd have the evidence to say. So just, that's a suggestion, not a demand, Rob. Just a thought. And 2, way back in 2018, when Ken drafted the first version of the noise ordinance that we started to negotiate, we actually, in one of those versions, did have language around vehicle noise that I think we had stolen from the city of Seattle. And it actually specified, and I know these numbers are wrong because I didn't look them up, but within 75 feet of such and such, or maybe it was within 20 feet of the roadside, if the volume below a certain speed is above a number, then that's a violation. And if it's above a certain speed, then there was a higher decibel limit. So there are, as Reb pointed out, there are cities who have done this, and they have done that to be specific about any kind of noise coming from a vehicle. That would even cover jack brake complaints we get, because we get those from the folks that live in West Asheville all the time. Trucks coming into town on 240 and I-40, when they're coming down the hill, instead of using their brakes, they, run the engine, and it's very, very loud. And people who live along I-240, we've received those complaints. So the right structured change to the ordinance with a proven track record from another city on how they measure it, could work.
Reb?
I was going to agree with his first comments. We did discuss the fact that signage and other means of public relations would or can be effective. I remember speaking to administrators in both Greenville and Knoxville, and they have employed those techniques, and I think they believe to some success.
We probably we probably need to ramp in the city attorney, because it was the city attorney that ultimately decided the fine size and fine escalation for any violation of the noise ordinance. And for example, my recollection is the Greenville signs said like fines up to $1,500 for violation of vehicle noise. Obviously, we couldn't put a sign that said that unless we have support from the city attorney to actually collect a fine of that size. And right now, it's a one fine structure for any kind of noise violation.
Right.
And we never talked about that during the construction of the noise ordinance, on whether certain kinds of violations, if we had language in the ordinance that specifically called out vehicle noise, whether that could be a different fine structure. And I just thought of this, that may come back to how the whole enforcement mechanism works. You know, it might be for enforcing with Todd's staff, it's, I'm gonna just say civil, whereas enforcing through the police, there may be a different fine structure. So those, you know, Brad Branham probably needs to be trapped in a room with you, Reb, and anybody who's helping you on this to explore those options, because we need to get him thinking out of the box rather than submitting ordinance language to him and then having him cut the fines in a quarter.
Gotcha. Reb, I have the other part that I didn't continue because when we were emailing back and forth, I sent you that diatribe of the work that I had done, you know, and my apologies, because I know I sent you that. I was like, no, he's not gonna, like, you're gonna need a, you know, sit down with a drink to read this thing. But I
read it.
You know, I knew, I was like, Rick's like, can you send him like an update, you know, like, and I meant to send you just a few sentences. And then I just was like, I'll just spell out everything I've done. And then I was like, if I got this email, I wouldn't read it. So my apologies, but
No, I read it.
I did get his.
Got it.
Okay. All right, good. I was just like trying to be thorough, but I did get to talking to Mark Matheny, and I do have like the contact for the sign person, because again, like I said in that email, I talked to Ben Woody, and they were, you know, because from my understanding is that these enforcement and like signage, these things sort of need to go hand in hand, right? So it's like doing some of the signage in it, you know, in tandem with having, like Rick was saying, like the hour of enforcement sort of needs, you know, makes the most sense, right? And so Ben had given me, or Mark had given me, the contact of the person for signage to see if how easy it would be just to get some signs up downtown on existing signs about noise. So I never followed through with that. So you and I can talk about, you know, taking that back over and what needs to happen in that regard. So at least we can figure out what's the feasibility of getting the signs, right?
Yep, sounds good.
And Councilwoman Mosley, like, I just want to say, like, part of what we're trying to do, like per what we were talking about earlier, is like, we're trying to, as a volunteer board, figure out like what are the things that we can take on and do. So it's that, and engage with the city. So it's like, while it doesn't seem like it's, there's definitely more pressing issues, but we know that this is still an issue. So if this is like, we can take care of some things that citizens are having problems with, but not put the stress and the workload on, for instance, APD more than needs to be, or city staff, then that's kind of the viewpoint that I feel like we've been trying to take, right? Is like, well, how can we civically put our time and energy into, you know, mitigating some of these problems, so that the higher ups can focus on the bigger picture, right? Or the more pressing things, if that makes sense.
I think that's a great idea. And also, my understanding is that the city manager will be presenting to the full council an update on the noise ordinance in a meeting either in January or February. So I would encourage whatever representative you pick to have conversations, I would say probably with Ben Woody before that time. And I think it would be a great opportunity to mention the very things that were mentioned today. And he, from a staff perspective, might be able to better guide you which way to go than I could. Because I don't know if there is, a human resources limitation or not. And it might be something where the suggestion might be made that an ordinance go to our governance committee.
Gotcha. Okay. Gotcha.
And then you might find yourself in a position where council votes to adopt. And then the enforcement would be very much like other enforcement mechanisms that we have, but I'm just not sure. But I do see that Todd has his hands raised, so he can correct me.
Thank you. Todd?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the ordinance and how enforcement would work on this currently. I think that Brad may be very tempted to tell you that everything that we want to accomplish, we can accomplish with the current ordinance, which we can. It's just a matter of specificity and clearness and that sort. It doesn't specifically address the issues we're having with vehicle noise downtown. Technically, the noise that these vehicles are producing is amplified noise that is being produced on a public right-of-way, and that is enforceable in the current ordinance as a noise disturbance. And so, as I've said before, it comes down to, educating the public that, we need, that this is constitutes a violation, and then also getting APD on board to help us actually enforce it. And enforcement at this point, based on the ordinance, would include them stopping the vehicle, collecting that person's information, and issuing them a warning that they are in violation of the noise disturbance ordinance. The language in the ordinance reads that if you violate again within 2 years, we can fine you at that point. And the first fine is $100, which is pretty steep for a motor vehicle violation. Now, you're not getting court costs there, but the fine itself is much higher than your average. Well, I don't know what they are today, honestly. 20 years ago when I was a cop, they were around $25, $50 for vehicle violations. And so it would, when a police officer pulls someone over for that noise disturbance violation and warns them, we wouldn't have to document that and get that information, get the driver information, get the vehicle information, and put that in our tracker so that if their name popped up again in the next 2 years, we would then issue them a fine. And it would probably be my office that's doing that rather than the police department. They're not going to have access to our, whether that person violated in the last 2 years the noise ordinance or not. I wouldn't think so. So, we could do that via mail or whatever. That's like we do any other zoning violation or coding violation or whatever. But again, what we're trying to enforce is enforceable with the current ordinance language. It's just not as specific as we might want it to be. And so part of the thing that the board is going to have to wrestle with is, do we want to go through the long, rigorous process of rewriting the ordinance? Or do we try to move forward with what we have and just focus on education and emphasizing that we need to enforce this part of the ordinance at this point?
Gotcha. Todd, can I ask you though? And that's a good question, because I wonder, there was a change to the noise ordinance that happened fairly quickly with the court case that happened, right? Because it was ruled that, I don't remember exactly what the wording was, but it was too ambiguous. And so there was a change. If you remember, at one point, Ben Woody went before council and was like, hey, this is the change that we've made. And so
the need
that
the need for that change was identified by the city attorney's office. And so
Right.
it went right through. And
Gotcha.
and it's a much more rigorous process for someone outside of the city's attorney's office to request and try to put forward a change to the ordinance.
Gotcha. But do you feel the way that it's written now, you know, because like Rick was talking about, if we need to lock Brad in an office to sit down with him and you know, propose a change if we need to. But are you saying like right now the way that it's written is like ineffective for us in terms of getting those vehicular stops because of it being written as a noise disturb? It would be because of the way that it's classified as a noise disturbance?
Yeah, so the noise disturbance standard is very subjective.
Very subjective. Okay.
It's very subjective. It's, well, that disturbs me, so it's a noise disturbance. And you know, this relates to the music venues as well. I have complainants who will complain one night about a noise disturbance, and then they readily admit they're not going to complain next week because they like the band that's playing next week. You know, so it's like, is the noise being a disturbance, or is it, you know, it's very subjective, right, as to when they're going to complain and when they're going to identify it as being a problem. So it comes down to basically officer discretion at that point as to whether they deem the vehicle is causing a disturbance downtown. And so, again, that's where, you know, we need to have a conversation with the attorney's office about this. We need to have a conversation with APD about this and kind of try to figure out where that line is, where they focus on enforcing noise disturbances relates to motor vehicles. The other option, the side of the coin, is the one that I think Reb and Rick are in favor of, which is where we actually, you know, write black and white what constitutes a motor vehicle violation and then try to enforce that.
Gotcha. Rick, you have your hand up.
There was a ton of debate in the last, let's say, 100 days before the first ordinance was submitted to the city council about when to be specific and when to just trust disturbance. I think it would be really good for us to have a meeting, maybe in the retreat, and invite Ben, because Ben was getting a certain amount of advice. I think it was from Raleigh, that really swayed him. My opinion, he can correct me if I'm wrong, that swayed him towards more disturbance related stuff. But now we have soon to be 2.5 years of trying to enforce disturbance. And I don't think it's going that great, but personally, you know, I think it's the whole subjectivity thing, just in certain circumstances, it's causing disconnect between the person who feels it and wants to complain and what enforcement can do. And I think we have to roll around in that. That's not specific to vehicle noise, but the disturbance one, we just got to ask ourselves, is it really working? And does it put too much pressure on the enforcement team to be that arbitrary judge about whether I'm complaining reasonably or complaining unreasonably? Right. So I think we just got to remember that was a big debate, and yeah, I think the city attorney will come down in favor of it because as disturbance, because basically it leaves it all up to judgment, and there's no statute or statement that the violator can say wasn't abided by, right? Because if you say we're going to set up meters and they're going to be 15 feet from the side of the road, and any noise we get above 67 decibels or whatever, then you got to prove it was set up 15 feet away from the road. You got to prove that the meter was calibrated. You got to, and this is where I think the conflict between law and citizens' desire comes and butts heads. And I think it's our job as an advisory board to, on behalf of the citizens, butt heads with the attorney and say, I know this makes taking it to court as easy as it can conceivably be, but we're taking nobody to court because it's not working, if that's how we really feel. So those are considerations for, maybe it's part of our retreat to just, Ben has been watching this first. He lived it very closely until he got promoted to assistant city manager, and he's been watching it ever since then. Next to Reb and I, he has the most history with this stuff, and it would really be great to get his perspective on how he feels these things are working out. Because if we could get his support, I think we would have a better chance of finding a common ground with the city attorney on terminology and a ordinance change.
Gotcha. Okay, so what I feel like actionable next steps are for this is to do some research, as Reb had mentioned, and see what other cities have in terms of language and enforcement for specifically for what we're talking about with modified vehicles, and then schedule a meeting with APD and the city attorney's office to have conversations based on some of that research that we found and talking about the issue of the subjectivity of enforcement. Does that sound like a good plan? Yeah. Okay. Does anybody have anything they want to add about vehicular noise before we move on to decibel measurement results?
Minor
Yeah.
point, just for the record.
Sure.
Todd, it doesn't matter to me if it's a modification to the ordinance or effective enforcement. I think what's important is that we show progress in alleviating, the disturbances across the community, and particularly in downtown related to vehicle noise. I do think that an ordinance modification makes it appear as if the board is doing its job, listening to people and creating effective law to help people in these problems. But at the end, however it happens, if it happens, it doesn't matter to me.
Good point. Thank you, Reb. Carmelo.
I'll be quick. I can't really disagree with much of what anyone has said. I think that, we've been kind of circling the drain on this issue and how to kind of grapple this problem of subjectivity and everything. Motor vehicle situation it's on the one hand, as some have pointed out, it's a very complex issue. You can't just, jump in and have a catch-all or, radically overhaul everything. You have to really cast a wide net with the information that you're collecting. So I'm completely in favor of what Reb has been proposing for quite some time of, having a sort of comparative analysis of what other cities are doing and everything. Now, obviously, none of us are saying like, let's just, part and parcel copy what one given city is. It's just good to have more information on the table, to have a more informed discussion. Does that necessarily mean that we're going to just find some new tactic that some other city has done and have an ordinance change? No, but it'll inform a discussion. I'm not opposed to some sort of minor modification to our ordinance. I just think that it has to be incredibly well informed and meticulous. And all this talk about like the noise cameras and the fines and all that stuff, like, that's a whole other can of worms as well. And, I know that last year there was the, what was it called? Lights On initiative. What is that? Is that what it was called? Where we basically now are facilitating this program where if a driver on the road has a taillight issue, then the officer who pulls them over has the opportunity to give them a sort of voucher. So it's, not like there's a difference between someone who has an automobile problem, like a technical problem with their automobile, and someone who's just intentionally being, flamboyant or obnoxious on the road. And I think that having that sort of distinction within that larger framework of like, well, you can get fined at a certain point for having these types of issues with your automobile or with your behavior on the road. Those are the kind of complex things that I would encourage us to just keep in mind if we're trying to, you know, navigate this framework of like warnings and fines and everything like that. Todd is right. The aspect of subjectivity is completely unavoidable for the majority of this project, unless you create some sort of like highly algorithmic surveillance state with like vast arrays of decibel readers that you know, are expanding through the whole city. And I mean that. It's going to be really tricky. I'm not saying it's impossible to get, like, you know, accurate, or ballpark rather, not accurate, ballpark measurements of something that a vehicle is doing at a given moment. But that's, I think, for the scale of our city and the problem of this in our city, that I would personally consider measures like that to be like, I don't want to use the word extreme, but like, you know, I think there are other resorts that we can discuss beforehand. And that's part of why I wholeheartedly agree with Reb of like, let's see what other cities are doing. Let's see what contexts they're operating within. Because, you know, like, we're not an extremely urban city, but we're not some like rural place either. And each of those are going to have their own unique problems. So it's going to be interesting to take into account like who is offering solutions in what contexts, and how can we maybe incorporate some of that information and rhetoric into ours, and see if it then helps in or points in a conversation towards any sort of modifications to the limit. So yeah, that's my understanding of the situation. I'm more than happy to proceed with what people are suggesting, collecting information on the other cities' ordinances, language, and everything like that. You know, like Jessica, you were rounding this up at the end, like the actionable steps just have to happen, and we just have to agree, like, all right, are we going to have a meeting, when, and who is going to collect the information of other cities' ordinances and stuff to bring to the table and better inform us during that meeting. What's that going to look like is I guess my end question now. I'm more than happy to help provide some of that research, I guess, like pick a handful of cities and see what their language is. But yeah, I'll put myself out there and end my rant with that.
Okay, thank you. And I'll just, Carmelo, just to point out, just before we go to Reb, I hear where you're coming from, and definitely don't want to make it where we're going after people who, you know, are having car issues, sort of things. What I can tell you from my research and interviewing people downtown is that it is very intentional. It's not somebody passing through downtown that's their muffler's fallen off, sort of thing. It's definitely modified vehicles that are going around for an hour, like doing, you know, just all around downtown and just doing loops and things like that. So it's somebody who's intentional. There's a lot of this intentional showboating sort of thing versus, you know, people who are, you know, are trying to get to work and have, you know, car problems and that sort of thing. So, but I hear you. And it's always important to keep that in mind, right? Too, because we're not, we don't want to have unintentional consequences where we're finding people who are already in a rough situation of, you know, they're like, yes, I know I need to get this fixed. I just, you know, waiting for my next paycheck, for instance, sort of thing. So I get that. So I appreciate that. Reb.
Don't get me wrong. I'm sorry. Really, I'm sorry, Reb. Don't get me wrong. I totally, that's a fact. You can't deny that. The majority of it are people who are, you know, intentionally being, that's why I use the word flamboyant and obnoxious. It's like, I've heard it. Mm-hmm. We know that on the roads, on the highways, whatever, no matter where you are in the country and the world, there are people who are doing that. And they make it tough on, you know, the minority of people who are actually like, you know, hey, I can't afford a good car right now, or I can't afford to go to the shop right now, or I didn't even know, you know, I'm too busy with my kids or whatever. I was not trying to make an excuse or anything like that. That's the majority of people. I was just simply saying that little bit of nuance in there is just what I wanted to kind of add into that too. Because to me, it is a similar situation maybe not similar, but I think like operationally analogous to the like situation that Lights On was trying to help with and mitigate. You know, that's all I was saying. I agree. It's a fact. You can't deny it. Yeah.
Reb?
Okay, Carmelo, you're on. I'm about to dump a trove of information on you, but I just wanted to say briefly, we don't really have to rely on other ordinances. There are a number of national clearinghouses and resources run by nonprofits on noise within communities. So I'll send you some links to that information. Maybe we can double team it.
Thanks, Rob. Rick, you have your hand up?
Part of the research needs to include what our lovely state will allow us to do legally. You know, Reb, you've sent me links to noise cameras and things like that. And before we fall in love with that or find that it's the most effective method, et cetera, we need to figure out whether the state would actually let the city do something like that. I'd hate to find that that is the quickest deterrent, you know, rent one, put it up downtown for a month and all the noise moves to some other town. But to find out that we'd be stopped instantly because there's a state statute that prohibits cities from using any form of camera citation system or something like that. Because, you know, the whole red light camera thing became a nationwide faux pas kind of thing about whether people were being incorrectly cited and whether it was accurate enough and all that sort of thing. So just be careful.
Okay, anything else on vehicular noise before we move on to the decibel level working group? Nope. Okay. Rick, you want to take this?
Yeah. I guess the first question is for the attendees who are here. You got the link to the spreadsheet earlier this week. I gave you suggestions and ideas on how to think about it, look at it, and all that kind of stuff. I'd like to just, if you need it on the screen, I'm assuming Ashley can present it so you can point out various things, but I'd mostly just like to hear everybody's feedback on what they think they saw and learned from what we measured. And I wrote up my own thoughts, but I don't really like to lead with that because I don't want to inhibit opposite opinions. So Carmelo, Jeff, Reb, Jessica, who wants to?
I haven't drawn any specific conclusions yet, but I have observed several things within the data. One of the things that interested me most is the ambient sound levels. That it's beginning to establish ambient levels across the downtown area. And it would be interesting to compare that information to the study that was prepared by Bruce Eichelheimer some years back when the city commissioned him to create a geospatial model of ambient across the city, which was one of the tools used to create the sound level limits within the ordinance. I think that would be an interesting comparison because the ambients don't rise to the level of the sound level maxes. And you can conclude, if you want, that maybe the sound level maxes are too high if the ambients are so low. There's a lot of cities that use ambient plus X as a way to measure sound level limits. So for me, it raises the question of our sound level limits and whether they're set properly relative to ambient. The other thing is that, and it's hard to draw a lot of conclusions from this little bit of information, but it seems to me that 85 decibels on a permit allowance is ridiculous. Nothing rises to 85 decibels, at least in this study. So I question whether a max or sound exceedance permit that grants 85 decibels makes sense. And those are really the things that grabbed me, other than the fact that there's some people out there getting hammered by noise.
Thanks, Reb. Who wants to go next? I'll tell you what, I'll call on people. Carmelo, you've got a troubled look on your face. What do you conclude from this?
I've been told I always do when I'm thinking.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the first line of October 13th, where the ambient recording of the salvage station session, you know, it would be interesting to see DBC limits of what other cities might do, but it's kind of irrelevant because their setups and orientations of how their neighborhoods intersect and how they brush shoulders up against one district versus another are going to be completely different to ours. So that's where my mind was at. It's like we have these DBC readings sprinkled in between the DBAs, but right now they're without a reference point, which is okay. It's just that's just
What does
where
that
my
mean?
mind.
What does it mean they're without a reference point? Just to help
Our
me
noise-
understand.
Yeah, sorry. Our noise ordinance is for DBA. It doesn't have an ordinance for DBC, right?
Right, and that's why we elected to take measurements, just to see if there was a correlation with the complaints, or just to know what because they're okay. Now I understand what you mean. Sorry.
Yeah, that's all really is. I'm glad we took the DBC, and it's interesting to look at their differences of DBA. Obviously, the DBC is significantly reading louder decibel ambient readings than DBA, as it's designed to do. It exaggerates certain frequencies to give you a it hyperbolizes the lower end of frequencies to overcompensate for their possible lack of representation in a DBA reading. At the end of the day, DBA will be more accurate, but to have them kind of in like a coherent model where you can reference the DBC as well is important. But it is interesting how there's a vast difference. I mean, like an ambient recording at salvage station at 8 a.m. is 37.4 dBA at the 5-minute mark, and on that same session, it's 55.9. And dB decibels, it's logarithmic. That's a huge difference. So that's where my mind was. I didn't have any glaring things. What was really honestly also coming to my head is how some of the people who we met, some of the residents, citizens, what have you, who we went out and talked to as we were doing the readings with them and everything, they were like, yeah, this noise source or this noise source was pretty amenable to discussion and maybe like working through what they can possibly do to mitigate their noise and their noise output and everything. And so I don't know how specific we're allowed to get here with like, names and places and things like that were mentioned to us. I'm not going to, brush up against that potential problem unless that door is open. But my mind was going more towards like, we've tried to be diplomatic to some extent with some of these places, and how can we continue that, because like we can tell some of these places, some of these venues that like, hey, guess what, we have a more strict ordinance, but like what in my head, like logically they're already exceeding the ordinance in some readings here. And so my question is like, what will lowering it offer to us on an actionable level that will be new, as opposed to like, if this is being exceeded at this particular time and, in this context, what can we do? So that's me thinking out loud here.
Okay, thanks. Before we go on, Ashley, are you still with us? You texted that you might have to.
I am. My computer is trying to do an automatic update, and I do not know how to delay it. And it said I have to do it within an hour, and I think that will kick me out of public input and everything temporarily. So if it does, I will get back and up and running as soon as possible.
Can you scroll the screen so we can see the rest of the columns that are to the right of S?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I think that will help because we weren't seeing the DBC outside except for the first number. Jeff, what about
If
you?
it disappears, that's what happened.
Okay. Reb, you had a question, and then I want to go to Jeff.
Well, I wanted to try and unpack a little of what Carmela was saying. One is that there's not necessarily a logarithmic change between A and C. They're different filters. They're allowing a different spectrum of sound. So a DBC is going to reflect a louder level simply because it's admitting more sound. And it's thought to be more accurate with respect to determining if entertainment sources are more bothersome or are bothersome. There's also a good bit of research, particularly in the community noise guidelines written by the World Health Organization, to suggest that if your DBC exceeds your dBA by as much as 10 decibels, it's making a good case to lower your dBA because the disturbance factor with respect to health related to DBC. But I just wanted to add those points.
Does that mean lower your dBA limit or lower the amount of noise actually physically being emitted in an area?
Ask that again.
You said that you said that there are certain cases that imply, certain studies rather, that imply that if your DBC reading exceeds your dBA reading by roughly 10 decibels,
yes,
that in some studies presents a case for lowering your dBA. And my question was, does that mean lowering your dBA limit or lowering the amount of noise in an area that will be picked up on dBA?
it's the same thing. I mean, if you lower your dBA or you lower your DBC, you lower your sound.
Well, if you lower the dB, if we impose a lower limit, say from 65 dBA to 60, we can lower it on paper and legally and with the council's permission and everything like that. But that doesn't change the physical world. We have to enforce that and get people to comply in that. And that's what I was bringing up before. Is just if we have a venue that's potentially that's being problematic and they're exceeding the current decibel limit. And we lower the limit and say, haha, now you're really exceeding the limit. Does that give us more leverage to address them, find them, approach them?
Let me answer that question. All of these complainants were told that the sound received at their property did not exceed the limit. Ever. That's how we picked them. There were other complainants who, when enforcement went out and they did a measurement, they found that the noise source was exceeding the limit and issued a warning. If that didn't take care of it, then they issued citations and all that kind of stuff. But this sub category of complainants complained, said they had stress from this, and were told that the sound source never broke the limit. Now, we have evidence in some of these measurements that they were breaking the limit. So we did something, I would say, right by how we approached where we went, when we went, and how we measured. But that is not reflected in, day out enforcement for these particular complainants. So this was not, these measurements were not grounds for a citation. That was always never part of this. This is fact finding. So one thing for sure, the ordinance never calls for indoor measurements, and there is no indoor decibel limit, right? There's only an outdoor decibel limit, which for the complainant who lives next to the Asheville Beauty Academy puts them in a position where they can never get a citation because it's coming through their walls. So we may learn, which is why we're having this discussion now, we may learn that the methods we put in place for taking measurements in this particular case better captured what was going on, and that we should learn something from this and how we apply that in subsequent enforcement efforts to see if what we're getting. So I mean, I just want to make sure, Carmelo, that you understood, as you're making really good arguments, that everybody who we went to was upset because they still felt stress from the sound that reached them, but were told that the sound was not in violation of the limits. Okay. Let me get Jeff and then Jessica, and then Jessica, you'll have to tell us if we're going to exceed our time, because I know we're moving along slowly, but it's an important thing. Jeff, what are your thoughts?
I think it'd be good if these also reflected exceedance permits on here. So we have an idea of if during those particular events, these are, controlled in the sense that they're limited in the amount of times this can happen per year, which is very different from what we're talking about with, say, a business that's every weekend or every night, like the Beauty Academy. So I think there's some more parameters we could put in this to kind of make some other differentiations on here. I did have one question, and I just want to make sure, because I want to make sure I'm reading this correctly, particularly when it came to those differences in the DBA reading that Carmelo was mentioning and the DVC reading on that first line. Were these 2 meters operating simultaneously, and those were the readings for each of those meters in those times?
Yes.
Okay.
So in all these cases, I forgot, Jeff, that you were the one person who we didn't co-opt into going out and doing this. There was 4 meters placed in each measurement position, with the exception of the very bottom one, since there was no outside in that case.
Right.
So we had a DBA meter and a DVC meter inside in the physical space that the complainant said that they could no longer use when the sound source was present, or not use effectively. And 2 meters placed on the outside, typically on a deck or a stairway or backyard. So we had 4 total running the same period of time, taking the measurements at these intervals. And the other thing that I think is obvious to everybody who went out on these is the 30-minute one is the average for the whole 30-minute period. And the incremental ones were taking averages along the way. And I think the goal there was to see if we happened to catch a 30-minute period where there was loud sound for 15 minutes and then they went on break or whatever it was, and then it dropped. But you could see that for the most part, they were just a couple of decibels apart throughout the whole thing.
Heard. Thank you for answering.
Sure. Any more, Jeff?
No, I'm still taking it all in.
Okay. Jessica.
Yeah, so, I was able to go on a few of these and do the sound readings, which I'm glad to have an opportunity to do, and I'm glad we have this data, because I think it's certainly helpful, and I was curious to see what the DBC levels were going to be, and really curious to see what it was going to be like in people's houses versus outside. And so one of the things that I found couple things. Well, one of the things that I found interesting when I was doing measurements is that I would write down on my sheet when I was doing measurements outside, when there was something that happened, like siren, like a vehicle, emergency vehicles went by, right? And there was other like sort of extraneous things that were happening in addition to getting those recordings, whether it was because I did both. I did both ambient recordings at some locations, and then I did ones when there was actual events taking place, right? And so it was interesting to see. I wrote that down because it definitely made the meter jump in both instances when those things happened from DBA and DBC level. But it was really interesting to see, you know, some of these, there definitely is, you know, one of them that I was on, the ambient recordings were louder than the concert recordings, which I thought was interesting. And part of that's just because there was other things, extraneous things that were happening. So it just, you know, part of that was interesting to see that there was, when there was other things happening, it amplified what else was already, if there was something else happening, is what it seemed like. The other thing that I found interesting looking at some of this stuff is that, so for instance, let's take the Beauty Academy, right? And looking at the inside results, right? Because this is where there's frustration for this complainant. It's not a huge decibel level difference from ambient to Academy. I guess I don't really, it's hard to know how much of a difference 55.5 is to 61.9, right? And then also to Reb's comment about the DBC, when it's like, if it's 10 DBC above what's set for the DBA level, you said that's when it becomes an issue, you're saying, in terms of stress level. Is that right?
Yes. And it's generally a measurement for when, if there was going to be an adjustment, you would do that. A 10 decibel differential between A and C. It means the presence of low frequency noise is high enough to be of real concern.
Gotcha. Okay. So just even like looking at this first ambient one, that's really interesting, right? If we're looking at there's definitely, you know, a 10 dB difference between the inside DBA and DBC. So it just makes me have more questions, basically, is what it is, right? For all of these things. Is like, I think it's definitely a good start. I'm glad that we have this information, but I'm also just wondering, you know, looking at some of these levels, most of them are, it seems like the majority of them are below 50 dBA, right?
Indoor? Is that
Indoor, yeah, looking at the indoor ones. And with looking at the what you sent, Rick, in your email, for preparing for this meeting. So 40 is, for just looking at the noise levels of dBs that you sent. So average home noise is 40, 60 is normal conversation background music from the thing you sent from WebMD. So looking at this, it's just interesting that it's seems like most of the indoor results, except for a few of them, fall within that average home noise to normal conversation, is what I take away from that. And again, there's a significant, seems like there's this, like, there is a significant jump with some of the ambient stuff though, too, from like DBA to DBC, like looking at the one from 927, like 30.9 to 51.5. That seems like a huge gap, right?
Ashley, are you still with us?
Yes. For the moment, I have about 30 minutes before my computer kicks me out.
Oh, okay. So since it's on the screen, I can't see what Jessica is talking about because she's probably looking directly at the document itself.
I'll tell you, Rick. Like if
just hang on a second. Can you, Ashley, can you go all the way back to the left for a second? Thanks. Can you hide some of these columns? Do you know how to hide a column in a worksheet?
It's been a while. Let me see. What column are you trying to hide?
So hide columns D, E, and F. If you just right click on them, right click now, you should get a pop-up that says you can hide. Yeah. Okay. Now we can see the times, the days, and whether it was an ambient or a concert. That's all I wanted to do, was I wanted to be able to see that while you were making your points. Thanks,
Okay,
Ashley.
yeah.
That's perfect.
Yeah, so see this one on 927, for instance. So see how like the DBA at 5 minute is 30.9, and then the DBC is 51.5. All I'm saying is, like, I'm just curious as to, like, that seems like a significant difference from DBA to DBC, right?
DBC.
Right, you're talking about
higher
ambient,
than
right? You're talking about ambient, right?
I'm talking about ambient. Yeah. What's that, Carmelo?
DBC is weighted so that it will always read. Well, maybe I can think of some exceptions. It will, by and large, read louder than DBA readings, because in DBA readings, they try to mimic how the human ear hears. Things get weird once you get down to low frequencies. They kind of escape human hearing, and high frequencies too. Like, the older you get, the less high frequencies you can hear as you get up towards 20,000 hertz. And I will perceive a very low frequency, like 30 hertz sound differently than everyone here. And that it just gets more strange, and it's not as consistent. So someone can perceive it, someone might not. Someone might feel it as a bodily vibration rather than a sound they can hear in their cochlea. That's just how it is. So what I'm explaining that for is because DBA tries to accommodate that and capture a general human experience, and so it weighs those low frequencies with less emphasis just in case. Now, it doesn't like erase them, it just doesn't register them at the same volume or amplitude levels as the mids and the highs. Now, the reason why there is DBC is because DBC tries to kind of overcompensate that gulf by, exaggerating the low frequencies by measuring them at the exact same weight as the mid frequencies and the high frequencies. Now, even though it's measuring them at the exact same ratio, all the lows, the mids, and the highs. The reason why I say exaggerates is because the human ear doesn't hear like that. It's extremely unnatural. So it takes a lot more amplitude and volume and power for you to hear a low frequency sound over a distance than it does to hear like a high frequency sound, like, me speaking, or like a whisper, or like the like FS kind of sound, like that kind of stuff. So DBC exaggerates like that. And that's why it's always going to be louder. And that's why I was saying, like, it's really interesting to see that difference. Like, because you're totally right. Like,
right. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
39.4 by 49.8. I mean, that's like a 10 dB difference is going to be like a volume difference of like 100 times power. And so like what Reb was saying, the way that they're filtered, DBA versus DBC, they just kind of it's a really confusing system, but DVC does emphasize those lower ones more, and therefore they're going to really ramp up the numbers fast. So that's why any decibel ordinance that is ever established, if we have a limit of like 65 is the limit for the noise ordinance in DBA, it's got to be way higher for DBC when we're looking at that scale. So that being said, I think what you were getting at is like, there are still some weird discrepancies that we need to kind of tease out here.
Right. Well, that was my question, right? Is like, so if we're, for instance, I'm just saying, like, if we're going to propose that, like, if it's at a certain DBC level, that it needs to be at this DBA level, right? My thing is like, there's such discrepancy between, like, I'm just using the ambience as an example, right? Because you can look at those and like, some of them, the difference between DBA and DBC is 10, right? And then some of them are 20. And then, and everywhere in between. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around that information of like, how do you set what the DBC, so say for instance, that's something we want to consider as a board proposing, right? How do you figure that out when there's that huge of a discrepancy from ambient recordings? Does that make sense? Like, I just don't, like, for just taking row 3, right, which is ambient, and looking at those, the DBA to DBC, and then looking at row, which one was I looking at? Looking at row 5, or looking at row 9, right? So row 9 is ambient, but those are way closer, some of those numbers, versus row 3 and 5. So I just don't understand, like, that's my question, is like, and it could be anything, right? Because these were inside people's homes. So maybe somebody's HVAC system was running and it had more, low frequency, in it, more low end in it and things like that. Maybe somebody, I don't know, is close to the train tracks or something, hard telling, right? Of that sort of information. So yeah, somebody's in the next room, I don't know. I'm just trying to get a better handle on that in terms of that information. So to me, this is fascinating, right? Like, getting all of this information. Like, I really wanted to know what some of these numbers were based on the complaints. And so what it's just done is like, I'm glad we did it. And it's just left me with more questions of what does this all mean? And then also, like I said, like, when I was doing measurements of, like, I would definitely take notes where I was like, emergency vehicles went by, and that sort of thing. So just so that it would be noted to see when there was a jump in those levels, that those things were taken into consideration as well. So,
to Carmelo's point, if you look at the bottom line on the beauty place, the ambient, running 61 dBA, 67 dBc. Todd and I were there. There was no noise there, but we sat in that room and had a conversation. So right there, you're looking at a pretty accurate collection difference between DBA and DBC. In other words, what DBA hears, so to speak, versus what it would be in DBC. Because that was the only noise in the room. So that's a pretty accurate example of what Carmelo is talking about.
Yeah. You're talking about for the ambient one?
I'm talking about ambient pre-event. That's just a conversation. That's the only thing that was happening in that room. Otherwise, it was really quiet. But the 3 of us, Todd, myself, and the complainant, sat in the room and we talked the whole time. And that's what a conversation.
Okay, so those numbers, for instance, on line 17, like, that was conversation.
That was just a conversation, yeah. And that's pretty consistent with what you'll see in Rick's graph that he sent out. A conversation is going to range between 60 and 70 dBA. But there it is expressed in DBC. As Carmelo says, DBC is always going to be a larger number because it's picking up more sound.
Mm-hmm.
The band of sound it's picking up is greater.
All right, let me,
So-
I sort of feel like,
Can I ask one more question, Rick?
yeah.
So, because that's the thing is like that was my other question on that. Reb, I don't know if you did the last one for the Beauty Academy when there was music going, because that was the other thing too. I was like,
I'm not present for that.
okay, because and maybe Todd can speak to this because it was lower. DBC was roughly about the same, but the DBAs were lower. Was that because there wasn't conversation happening then?
I might be able to guess. The DBC probably was picking up things that the human ear can't. So like when there was a time where, oh my gosh, the other guy who was out there, what was his name? Chris?
Chris.
Okay, thank God. We were out there and it was like we could hear a little bit of music, but it was like what Rick was saying, like jake braking, traffic, like ambient hum, like wind going through the trees, like leaves falling, things like that. And it was kind of like that was the ambient sounds that were just in that environment. Whether you were those are outdoor examples, but there were indoor ones too, where it's like you don't hear the like electrical hum of a house, or like you said, the HVAC system, or how the wind is moving around a house. And like buildings and structures act as giant whistles, whether we hear it or not. There's low frequencies being generated by things just existing in nature. And the DBC is picking up on that, whereas our ears and bodies aren't. So it's like,
Gotcha.
That's why
Okay.
it's so weird, like what you point out, where the ambient DBC was higher than the actual event readings. And my guess is that it has something to do with the similar situation that Chris and I experienced, where it's like there just happened to be a lot going on that night other than that, and it all kind of compounds. It's like even that blows open like the accuracy of ambient recordings too. I'm not saying like let's complete relativism and let's throw all this to the wind. I'm just saying you're right to point out how just complicated this is.
The cicadas. Oh my gosh.
It was really loud. Really
Whoa,
loud.
that was pretty intense when I did some outdoor readings.
So I took
anyways.
I took the readings for the Beauty Academy during the nighttime, when the club was open.
Uh-huh.
And there was no conversation in the townhouse or apartment. There were three people. There were three adults there. Again, we just didn't have a conversation this time. And
Because I wasn't there.
perhaps. And so the property owner also, admitted that the windows had been upgraded in the last 6 months or so. And so the level of noise that she heard from the club, which she still considered to be a disturbance and an inhibitor for her to have a restful night and stuff like that, particularly at 1 or 2 a.m. It just wasn't as loud as it had been before. I could definitely hear the noise from the music that they were playing and would have found it disturbing if I were trying to have a restful night there. And I went out in the street and measured the noise in the street after I was complete inside, just to make sure that they were within the decibel limits that we have for the CBD there. And they were, even with the door of the venue, wide open and people coming and going and standing out on the street talking and all of that stuff. So that's why the numbers look so low compared to what they were in ambient. It's just that, Reb and I both have fairly deep voices. And so those would come across, you get a pretty good high reading, I would think, just from conversation that way. But yeah, that's the story behind those numbers.
Okay. Yeah, that's only questions that I have, other than a clarification. Isn't the ordinance limit in CBD 72, not 75?
No, I don't think so. I think it's 75.
I think Jessica's right.
Really? Okay. I didn't.
I think it's
I didn't go back and
72.
look it up. I didn't go back and look it up. Okay.
Just for FYI of
Okay.
data. So,
Okay.
but
I'll
thanks for organizing,
You're
Rick.
correct, Jessica. You are correct.
Okay.
72.
I think. Yeah. Okay. So basically, on the 28th, Rabbit was above the limit across the board, right? DBA.
They have a permit to exceed?
They do have a
They
permit.
do.
Yes, they do. They do have a permit.
They're the only permit to exceed. And
I think they can
and
go
some
as high as,
previous-
I think they can go as high as 85.
They can.
they can.
Which is
I'm
crazy.
trying to figure out how to put a bow on this with whatever observations I had that are not already covered. I think for any go forward plan, we need to bring reputable resources to, written resources to bear on DBC, specifically as it's used to measure stress on human beings when music is present. Carmelo he knows a lot about this stuff, and I get a little lost in his arguments. And I tried to do some research, and I hit a few websites, and at least one of those websites said that DBC is actually a better measure for the impact of music on human stress, because it's not about how you hear it, it's how your body responds to it, and does it cause you stress. And stress is most frequently expressed by complainants. I can't go to sleep, right? So my own personal experience with the first measurements on 9/8 was that 66 DBC, I wouldn't have been able to go to sleep in their bedroom, which is where we measured it indoors. And the complainant said to me that the only way they could go to sleep before the concert was over was to put sound canceling headphones on. And I don't think that that's treating residents reasonably. I just don't. It shouldn't be the responsibility of all 50 homes that are on those 3 blocks that are above Salvage Station to all go out and personally buy noise canceling headphones so they can go to sleep if they need to, or to give it to their kids so they can do their homework if they need to, so that they're not distracted. I think that the sound source has a responsibility to mitigate that sound level and work on it, but we have to have reputable scientific definitions that we don't disagree with. So whatever next steps we're going to do, we need to bring the data to the table and debunk the website that I found that said that DBC is a better measurement of the stress on human beings than DBA for music or not. I was surprised by how high the DBC was in ambient, but that was really good to know. And when I went and did my research, I think I went to more like DBs for dummies than probably the scientific places that Carmelo goes, because they described all the DBs, DBA, DBB, DBC, and DBZ. And the way they describe it to me is, what kind of a filter is there on the whole sound spectrum? And DBA has a filter on the sound spectrum that knocks down the low frequency stuff and knocks down a little bit of the high frequency stuff. But when it comes to DBC, it doesn't knock down the low frequency stuff. So it's more of it gets through to the device that's consuming it and producing it. And DBZ has no filters whatsoever. So it covers the entire available spectrum of sound waves. Another website actually said DBC peak, not a DBC average, is a better measure of human stress, because it's not necessarily about whether you're being subjected to something for 30 straight minutes. It's whatever you're trying to do where sound gets in your way of doing it effectively. It's whether it wakes you up. You know, it's like a thunder crash or somebody cracking cymbals or a car crash in a neighborhood, or, you know, a limb falling off a tree and hitting the roof. It wakes you up. And I think we need scientific assessment of those things before we make any recommendations about the use of DBC one way or the other. The DBA results measured from back porches and back decks and things like that during sound present things basically make your back deck not useful. I want you to think of anytime you wanted to go out on your patio or your back deck and just relax for a minute and have a beer and just relax, and imagine that your two least favorite neighbors are sitting 3 feet away from you having a conversation for 2 hours. Because if it's near 60 decibels, that's what it is. It's like people sitting 3 feet away from you, carrying on a conversation, not raising their voice, but basically you can't just tune them out. And that just makes me believe that our current ordinance doesn't protect the homeowner from losing the use of the outdoor portions of their property when the sound sources are present. I thought that I would conceivably discover the same thing inside, but we really didn't. I thought we'd see some higher DBA numbers inside that would indicate that people are losing access to their living room or whatever is on the side of the house that's closest to the sound source, but only the 1028 Rabbit Rabbit concert, which was cranking up high, got close to that. So yeah, the complainant in that case, you know, if what they like to do with their evening is sit and read a book or listen to soft music or meditate or something like that, they can't in that room. And therefore, I think they have a right to be dissatisfied with the decibel levels that exist in our ordinance. So I think we got to get the DBC definition and how it does or does not properly represent stress to human beings when the sound source is amplified music. We have to come back with that science. Otherwise, we're just going to argue with each other, I think. And so that would be something that I think we should consider for next steps. And at the same time that we're looking at other cities' ordinances who do take DBC into account, either as Reb recalls from some of the research we did 3 or 4 years ago, by when low frequency sound is present, then reducing the allowable maximum by 5 dBA, or by actually including DBC as a measurement category. I don't know which, but I think we owe it to the public to do that. So those are my conclusions, and I saw hands up, Jeff.
Yeah. Also, I just want to be mindful of time check. It is 2:30. And so Jeff and Carmelo, if you guys want to say something, and I want to wrap it up so we can move on to new business, which won't take long.
Well, if I may, an example, Rick, I'm looking at the ambient noises from 11.6 versus those event noises or levels, dBA levels on 1028, and they're pretty close. I just wanted to point that out.
So the 11.6 inside ambient was 3 people carrying on a conversation throughout the entire measurement period. Right, Reb?
Correct.
So hypothetically, if there was worth doing it, we should go back and do that over with it quiet, like it was in all the other ambient measurements that there were. Just that's just a peculiarity of how that particular measurement was done. So I just want to make sure that you understand that one.
I get it, but they're still pretty close considering.
Okay.
Yeah, but Jeff, it's not their conversation.
Carmelo,
Right.
did you have something?
I mean,
It's like,
I could go on and say I live really close to my neighbors in my backyard, so we do have conversations at the same time they're having conversations, and we're out there the whole time. It's just, or if I want to sit out there by myself.
So I think I don't really want to put words in your mouth, Jeff, but it seems like you're debating whether the equivalent of 2 people having a conversation 3 feet away from your head is a stressor for a human being or not. Is that?
No, I didn't say that. You're
Okay,
putting words in my mouth.
sorry. Okay, sorry. Then I don't understand the comment.
Carmelo, do you have
Carmelo?
anything to add?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I don't mean to, push back in any way, but I've never seen a source that discards DBA and prioritizes DBC measurements over it. OSHA and the EPA do advocate taking DBC readings, but they do not do so in the context of like discarding DBA readings. And they do that because DBC is incredibly useful and valuable for adding and making the data more rich when you have DBA, and then you have like a loud workplace, hazardous environments, places with environmental noise, what have you. Their guidelines are going to be, their suggestions are use DBC and bring that more heavily into the conversation when you're picking up average readings of 85 dB or higher. That's where it's like, of course, that's really going to be hazardous to health. But there's also extra caveats there where it's like, even though this is from OSHA and the EPA, they say that even though DBC is really useful for like predicting the perception of, some workplaces' loudness, like the subjective perception of it, whether it's annoying, whether it's hazardous, what have you, the A-weighted scale has a better predictor of hearing damage and like how it impinges upon the body and whether or not it's a nuisance. So I'm just quickly reiterating that like we can't discard DBA because it's going to be more useful in almost every context to have that as part of the discussion. And by saying that like DBC and even DBZ and even more, rare type of measurement are less filtered, that doesn't mean that they're going to be less biased. It's just, if anything, it can be more biased because the human hearing does not perceive frequencies at the same amplitude across the frequency range. Like it perceives the frequency range different everywhere. But also like the thing that I want to get to that I feel like we're straying away from is we can talk all day about like which measurements to use and which can be valuable, but we're sitting here with just a tiny little bit of data. We're seeing a few examples of how there were some places that exceeded the dB limits, right? We're looking at that right now. Now, this is my take. Would it not be a good first step to look at those particular examples and ask ourselves, how would we address this? Can we address it? What would the steps be? What would it look like? And can we use that as a case study for addressing other noise source issues that are either, well, let me word it like this. Can we address the ones that are exceeding the current limit now before lowering the limit and having way more on our plate to address? I feel like we're going to learn more if we do that and take some actionable steps, and also have, a better track record as a board with, actionable steps, saying like, before we even advocated lowering this or changing this, we did see some areas that were, problematic, where there's some exceedance here, and we tried to address those before going forward. And we used all the information that we gained from addressing those things to better inform how we proceed, whether or not we do really need to lower things here or there or whatever. Like, we're seeing problems here, and then we're trying to create more. And I'm not trying to dismiss, the problems, the whole slew of problems that are on the table in front of us. But I mean, like, there are some actionable things that we can do and learn from here before, changing things and having a more like high level theoretical discussion or what have you. Like, I'm just trying to put forward, like, what can we have that be part of our conversation, and can someone push back? I want to hear the argument against that, like, genuinely, as to like why we should, like, acknowledge that there are problems, there are noise limit exceedances right now that we're looking at with our current ordinance, and why we should, ignore solving those for the time being for the sake of, reassessing, is the ordinance really correct right now, when we can do both by addressing the problems and the noise exceedances we currently are looking at and learning from that, if that makes sense.
That sounds like a perfect discussion for our retreat that we're going to talk about.
I think if we have people who are willing to volunteer and do work, we can do both. That's the job of the noise ordinance board. We are not a one-trick pony.
Mm-hmm.
We worked on this, and if it weren't for personal conflicts of some people who just, couldn't give the volunteer time they wanted to, we would have advanced the cause on vehicle noise at the same time. So I think you're right. I think the measurement methodology that was deployed here and the exact location of how those measurements were taken is something that we need to sit down with the enforcement team and say, what's what. And the other thing that, this reminds me of, Carmelo, because of the way you were so passionate about this, we don't have and will not have in the near future on the spot responsive enforcement measurements, right? When a complainant calls, nobody's going to be there in 30 minutes for the nighttime concert stuff. Todd's got one guy who signed up to work off shifts. What did we learn? If we plan to go make measurements at places where there have traditionally been complaints at the time concerts are performed, we learned something. So why don't we discuss in the retreat a proactive, prescriptive, go out and make sure that everybody's complying? Why wait for a complaint that we can't get to by the time the noise source has gone away? Because we didn't warn the venues we were going to be out there taking these measurements this time, so they couldn't say, whoa, enforcement's going to be there, so let's turn everything down a little bit so that we make sure we stay under. We could ask enforcement to do that proactively throughout the season when any noise source is known to be present on a regular basis. And Todd will either agree to that or need staff or whatever it is. So we can take that on, and we can take on whether other noise ordinance that take DVC into account have a good reason to do so and have science behind it.
Okay, I'm gonna stop you there because we're running out of time.
Yep.
And I want to just move on to new business quickly and then get to public comment if we have any. So the annual report is due in, I believe it's January 19th. So Rick and I typically put that together, and it's submitted to City Council, talks about the work that we've done over the last year. This is where we can put some trends in terms of what we've seen over the last couple of years of with noise complaints and where things are at, the work that we've done, and also it's an opportunity for us to present some areas of focus moving forward. Our next meeting is on January 8th, so we'll have an opportunity to share that with the board before it gets submitted. So just wanted to put that out there to everybody to start to think about that. You know, obviously this meeting, we had a lot of things to discuss. I'm sure we all want to go back and digest that and perhaps think about what we want to focus on for the future and just how we want to inform City Council of the work that's been done thus far. So I'll just put that out there. And lastly, we did a retreat in the beginning, I believe, of 2023. It seems like so long ago, right? As we're here on December 11th. I would love to do that again. I don't know actually how we need to do that, Todd, as it pertains to city. But I just want to see how everyone feels, if everyone's up for having a retreat again so that we can hash out some of these ideas and ideally before the 19th, which I think it would be great if we could do it before we have the annual report due. If not, I totally understand, but maybe Ashley or Todd can give us a little bit of information on what parameters we need to stay within of doing getting together. And I know it needs to be made public and all of that, but Ashley or Todd, do you have any information in terms of the guidelines for us getting together to do a retreat?
No, not here at the tip of my fingers. We'll have to look at that. I mean, I know there's no issue with you doing it, whether it has to be broadcast live like this or just be open to the public. I don't know. We can get that answer here fairly quickly.
Okay, thanks. Is everyone open to meeting in person and doing that? Yeah, Reb? Rick?
The more advanced notice we can have, the better. But yeah, totally.
Yeah, I mean, I ideally I'd love to get that scheduled before everybody goes on break. So by the 22nd. So we'll find out, we'll see what we can figure out from the city, and then I can always set out a doodle to everybody of like, what's your availability? Right, okay. Okay, any questions, comments on annual report or the retreats? No? Rick?
I don't think we could get the retreat in, reach conclusion, and update the annual report by the deadline we've got, right? Because
Gotcha.
Great thing about retreat is you can really have deep debate, and a lot of time it just leads to a bunch of action items and that kind of stuff. And I wouldn't want to cut off debate in order to include a bullet point in an annual report. I just
Sure.
If we can pick the topics that we're, if we can somehow with email and stuff pick the topics we want to cover in the retreat, that would be a good thing to put in the annual report. Is we're going to go debate these things because we think they're important on the activity of the Noise Advisory Board in 2024.
Gotcha. Heard. Okay, any other questions, comments? All right, Ashley, are there any callers in line for public comment?
I do not have any callers. You guys just had those two emails that were referenced that came in, but I think you pretty much covered that material during the vehicle noise.
Yeah, we definitely did. So made sure to reference that, and that hopefully those folks have tuned in and heard that we are trying to work on something. Rick?
I got a reporter from the Citizens Times reached out to me today to talk about something. I think I put her off. I said, "Hey, you want to talk about noise? Come to the Noise Advisory Board meeting." And I sent her all the
Perfect
links
time.
and
She could be on
all that
comments
kind of
right
stuff.
now. Yeah.
But she didn't. And I went back and looked at it, and somebody is complaining to the Citizens Times about a gun range.
Oh.
And I don't know if there is a gun range in the city of Asheville. So is there one?
So we have responded to that. The city has. I was a part of putting that response together. So I would wait and see if you hear from them again or not.
Could we have access to the response, please?
I don't. I can send you the notes that I sent to the public affairs office. I don't know what they actually sent forward to the newspaper, the journalist who requested the information.
Okay,
I
that'd be great.
I can send you her information, and you can ask her for that.
That'd be great. That'd be great. I'd sure like to know if the public, whatever officer it was.
Essentially, what we put forward was the noise ordinance does not address discharging a firearm. There is an ordinance that limits discharging a firearm within the city limits unless it's at an established range, and we do have a few ranges in the city limits. And so it would again default to the noise disturbance portion of the ordinance, and we would have to have a significant number of people complaining about the gunfire in order for that to be a disturbance that would elevate to our level of concern or whatever. These ranges have been there for a very long time, and we're only getting one question from a journalist at this point about them. We haven't gotten a complaint about the firearms being fired at the ranges in the 2 years that we've been collecting this data. So that was basically what I sent to the public affairs office.
Okay.
Okay. Let's see. Any last comments before we adjourn? Okay. Is there any objections to adjourning this meeting? No. Okay. Hearing none, this meeting is adjourned. Our next meeting will be on Monday, January 8th, 2024.
Whoa.
Thanks, everybody, for your time.
Right. Bye.
Okay. Bye.